Hi, I'm Mark Freydl. I'm here with my business partner, Ben Ghazi, and also Mike Levan. We're Codiac, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this product for SREs and everybody else on the team. We all know the DevOps cycle, that continuous ongoing loop that we all want to follow. I'm going to simplify that down a little bit, and let's focus a little bit on the build and release cycle. When we build a container, that build process tends to be very specifically an engineering process. We know that, we love it, some of us more than others, but that really tends to be that engineering process. Once that container is built, we move on to the release process, and that is a business process. It's a team process. It's full of a whole bunch of different people that are involved in a lot of different business decisions on what hopefully is a built container. That job of the SRE, central in this diagram I'm showing you, has a lot to do, has a very complicated job and a lot of different points to communicate on. And right now, the scaling of infrastructure out there, is a very well-known, very well-traveled path, but the scaling of this little process, well, it's not scaling so well. So Codiac is addressing that directly. There's a lot of friction in that process. So Codiac brings that product out to that SRE and hopefully can give that SRE a platform in which all those communications can go well. Because right now, this is kind of what's happening. We've got people speaking different languages on all those different conversations that those people are having, and there's a lot of friction. What does that really mean? I mean, that we've seen this before. Those types of conversations, all that friction, all those different bits of knowledge, the thing we didn't do, the thing that we needed to do, the thing we overlooked because we didn't have enough time, they all add up. Basically, that impact, time, cost, and risk. That risk is not violent enough to show you there, but we've all been through that. We've all had that 3 a.m. wake up, big or small. It's a tiny little fix. It takes 2 seconds. Well, it's going to affect my marriage. So anyway, the current state of things with all the products that are out there and all the complexity that's out there, I've heard people say the word snowballing. I've heard people talk about how it's too complex for one person to understand. Well, we can't take all that exists right now and try to herd it all into something that's symphonic and harmonious. So we really had to rethink it. And so we basically took a step back and said, let's rethink the way we do these things. We know that repeatability is absolutely critical. And the ability to put infrastructure on demand, infrastructure is code we love. Infrastructure on demand means repeatability and portability. We want to build once, and then we want to configure on deploy. That was a big part of the design directive here. Also, there was a central intuitive coordination. That little piece right there underlies everything that we do. That intuitive interface, that ability for everybody on the team to speak the same language. And then we had to make it extensible. So that landed us on a CLI and a GUI so we could speak in all these different contexts. There's a browser you can talk with. There's a console for an administrator type or a CLI lover like myself. And then finally, there's your pipeline. So Codiac is going to interact with you on all those different fronts. And now our conversation, now that we're speaking the same language and we're showing the right type of tooling out there, everybody can understand it's, hey, which version passed QA? Well, he's saying check it out, but he really doesn't even need to be part of that discussion. The number of discussions that can go on when our PM, for instance, can look at Codiac, and I'm showing you a lot of noise here, but basically what Codiac is showing you is that I know where your services are. I know where your infrastructure is. You came to us to create those environments, so I know where your cluster is. I know what versions of which services you put out there. I can tell you. And what we're doing, again, the intuitive part, is we're trying to make sure that everybody on that team can look at that same piece of information and understand it. Well, what's that common language? It's SDLC. And so all these features surround that and that common language. We have the inventory of all your services. And the snapshot deployment is basically the idea of, well, I have 30 services. When I deploy, they all go together. So what matters is the collective version. So that's what a snapshot is. We can deploy an entire snapshot at once. Also, the central dynamic configs. Remember I told you config on deploy? That's the build once, deploy everywhere. Well, that happens here centrally so that people can make those updates and we can move those containers wherever they need to go. Finally, the automated ingress, I don't want to spend any real time on here, but anybody who is involved in that process who has implemented that process, who's woken up at 3 in the morning to deal with that process, knows that when we say it's fully automated, it's part of the kit, it's hands off, it's strategically implemented. That's a lot of words that really mean a lot. Finally, we know where all your systems are. We know where all your hardware is. We were with you when you created your environments. So we can add zombie mode to it, which basically says you want them shut off on the weekends. You want your development environment scheduled to shut off every weekend. That's great. So that's your zombie mode. It drops everything down to 0 replicas, drops down all of your nodes. So you're in good shape there. Just covered a whole lot of stuff in just a very short period of time. If you forget everything, you want the TLDL, I didn't listen, or I don't care, or it was just simply too long to understand too much detail. We are bringing SDLC to the infrastructure game. We're saying that SDLC is that common language that the team can interact on. Ultimately, what is all that worth? That's wonderful. We can have an academic discussion about it. But the reality is that once all that mechanics, all that syntax lookup, all that manual YAML development is behind a UI, and once that's reliable and repeatable by anybody on the team, we can now elevate the conversation and start talking about performance and utilization and where's the bottleneck and what's our priority. Those are the types of discussions that an SRE can have with the rest of the business team.
I'm having a little difficulty with one of the concepts you sped past.
Oh yeah.
And maybe you sped past the explanation, which is build once, configure on deploy.
Sure.
Yeah. What do you mean by that, especially in this context?
Yeah. Let's go. So during the build process, we've got branches of code. We're building code. We're branching off. However any team wants to discuss it, they all have their own unique flavor of that. Ultimately, it lands in a container. And when we build that container, that image that we push out to Docker Hub or push out to one of our container registries, that is a sole item that we can then move and migrate up across our different environments. Take that same container and put it in dev. Well, I want to take that same container and we're going to move it to QA. Well, you can't do that if you built it and put your configuration in it. The idea is that, no, I want that container, that code. I don't care what branch it is because that's the code I tested and that's the one I want out there. Don't change it. So we can take that one container, configure it when we decide to put it out to dev, and it lands in dev with all of its configuration intact. Does that make sense?
And I feel like you're talking about cross lifecycle consistency from the developer, the software engineer standpoint, that they can promote and not concern themselves with where it's landing.
You can, yeah, obviously.
Because for them, it's the same. It's not landing anywhere new. It's just the same dang thing. They push the promote button, and nobody, including, I suppose, the platform engineers, are sitting there saying, oh, well, now that means we got to do a shift.
Exactly. We don't need to do that. We don't have to play games based on, well, where are you putting it? Because, no, that configuration is central, and it's in place, and it gets picked up when we decide where it's going to go. So you can configure and build your containers for local host, so they run on your local machine, but you technically don't have to care. You'll want to be on that team. I'm sure every developer wants to somehow be involved in that process, but you don't have to. The days, and I've had a couple customers mention, remember when we could just build a thing and throw it over the fence? There's a little bit of that here. Anyway.
To answer that question, because that's something that I'm going to talk about a little bit during the demo as well, but this is the idea. You take something like Helm, or you take something like Customize, and the idea is you have a couple of different environments, dev, staging, UAT, prod, whatever, and then within that, you have your templates. You take your templates and you move them between environments. You do your deployments and that. Problem is two things. Number one, you still got to go in, edit those templates, because you have like a values.yaml file, for example. You go in, you edit that, you deploy it to where you want to go. And then the other problem is you still have to manage a mess of YAML. And not only do you have to manage a mess of YAML, but you have to manage more YAML. With this, the idea is you literally have one location, whether you're changing environments, cabinets, which I'll get into, and you go in there, you change your value. So maybe you have 2 replicas in dev, you have 4 replicas in staging, you have 5 replicas in prod. You do it in one place, one location, no YAML, no nothing. It's automatically updated for you. And then you go, you take your asset and you drag and drop. And regardless of where that asset is, dev, staging, prod, whatever, you can either A, point it to those configs, or B, have something like the snapshots, which again I'll show, to literally take that entire environment, all the configs, however many replicas you had, whatever your annotations are, whatever, drag and drop to locations. No CD process there, no CLI, well, you could do the CLI process, but you don't have to do the CLI process. No manual deployments on the terminal, nothing. It could be as simple as a drag and drop or just a command.
What drove you to start this? Like, where were you before? What were the experiences that drove you to start this? Because it's a great thing, but it's nice to hear what kind of kicked you.
What's that? Emotionally?
However you
No.
want to describe it, but yeah.
Ben and I have been in the industry for a couple decades each, and it got to a point where I was really excited about what's out there. There's so much good tech, and every time you want to implement something, especially even a weekend project is a really good example. Like, well, if you want to do something on the side, you know what you're getting into. Like, there's this much of the new tech, and then this much of all the stuff around it. Like, well, don't go thinking that it's all rainbows and ponies and everything, because we've got a lot of YAML to build, we've got a lot of SRE work to do, we got all this stuff. And we said, look, all that stuff is science. It's not all of it, but a lot of that is science. And why do we need to waste our time on that when there's so much good things that we could be doing? And the elevated discussion I was talking about, like, I'm sick of talking about and looking up syntax and learning everybody's domain-specific language of their particular YAML, when in reality, I get it that everybody's competing for the uniqueness of each cloud service provider. But to me, it's a node. It's got memory and CPU, and I just need to implement it. So I said, look, at least let's make this agnostic. But what if we made it triggerable? And what if we sort of, like I said, brought it back? So it was really if we don't do this, I might not be a software developer anymore, because I just don't like where it's still.
So I get the persona SRE. I get that SRE probably sits into inside of a platform group inside of whatever organization. How do they get their buying center to purchase this? Like, how do you stop from some of your larger competitors with ELAs coming in and saying, this feature is already an ELA. What's the hook? Like, what's the ultimate business value that gets me to actually get this cut a PO for you guys?
Yeah, I'd love to go on that. You want to cover that? Okay. Yeah, what's this right here? There's a lot of philosophy behind this. There's a lot of passion behind this, and there's a lot of let's enable the team. And you can't do that with a side feature. You can't do that with part of the system. Like, I would love to have just said, hey, let's just kick out the config system. That's an much easier thing to get funded. It's a much easier time stretch to put together. But the reality is to make that drag drop, get everybody involved, get everybody under the same language thing, you have to have a closed loop. And so all those pieces have to be in there. It also has to be open to extensibility. So the ability to say, well, we've got that process together. We're speaking on a common language. We're leveraging as much as we can the expertise that's on the software side, giving you everything you can get there, and leveraging also abstracting out the IAC side, which is a growing, evolving thing that we know we're not just going to try to define right now. So anybody technically could come along and do that. But what we found is that this is very contrary to a lot of what's out there in the industry. The think is going in this direction. And we said, hold on a second, we pull back this way, change it, and go forward. You've got all those pieces knitted together. And so, does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so one last clarification. From a technical perspective, if I was the decision maker and I was the SRE, I'd buy this tool. If I'm the CTO and I'm thinking about large organizations, most of my coverage area is Fortune 500 and larger, I could not get this through procurement because this looks too much like what we've already bought. I'm not understanding. If I needed to explain this to procurement, I'm not understanding how I get this past procurement.
Here's I guess the pitch for the CTO level, right? Kubernetes we're at KubeCon, right? Kubernetes is the best place in the world to run apps and run software. It will scale to the ends of the earth. It's a beautiful system. And Kubernetes is also probably the worst place for teams to run software. Like, it totally drowns your team in tech. It's really, really difficult. And the folks that build against Kubernetes and infrastructure as code and all these things are, they are essentially the bottleneck and the pinch point for what? Business, right? So a team that can be well-oiled, efficient, and get features out quickly, that business makes more money. Hands down, full stop, right? If you're mired in the esoteric bottom of the basement, I don't know how to get the site arranged to get this thing working on this node in this Kubernetes cluster so I can auto scale properly. How does that tie to the business? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right? And so we're saying you need auto scaling, you need Kubernetes, you need the most beautiful system KubeCon can deliver, but you need it in a way that we can actually consume it as a business. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And going back to the question of how we got started, he and I have been systems architects, team leads for far too long. We got a lot of experience with this stuff. We went heads down and sort of, we had that light bulb moment of like, it just kept stacking up on our teams. Everything, all this stuff kept stacking up. Every team, every project that we did, the Martin Fowler team before tools, that's a great sentiment. But I'll tell you, tools will drag down a team. And so we sort of had that light bulb moment of like, we have to manage automation this way instead of this way. So I sold my house. He moved from Tampa. We bought RVs. We moved to the middle of nowhere and we started building for 2.5, almost 3 years. We carried a couple customers with us, but we built and we built and we built because we knew what we wanted to build. We are the customers. We knew exactly like it has to look like this or we're not actually fixing the problem.
Just wanted to add one thing, which is, if anybody knows me, they know I harp on lifecycle. I harp on everywhere I can find lifecycle, which is kind of everywhere. System lifecycle, especially app dev lifecycle. I feel like there are so many vendors out there who act as though everything is prod all the time, forever, and they position themselves that way. They talk about their product in that way, I like the comprehension of the uncountable problems that occur and friction in release, in the various stages of release, as every bit of code gets promoted from sandbox up to ultimately and hopefully production. And I don't think CI/CD in any way, if anything, it makes that problem more acute. So that's. You
touched on something really, really important. CI/CD is the tool of the day, right? In my opinion, it's the hammer and everything's the nail. So much gets buried into CI/CD that it stacks up. You get dead in there. You get weird stuff. You get bash scripts. You get secrets. You get your security footprint kind of grows. It gets esoteric. You have to have a wizard. Everything starts feeling like this is breaking down on us, right? And so CI/CD, while is helpful, is not the full story, right? Automation is not a CI/CD thing, while everybody thinks it is, right? So like automation is just automation. Like, how do I get my team to understand that when I have microservices that need to mirror, like our team internally, every time they create a new environment, it looks and feels exactly like production, right? Because the closest we can get our lower environments to act like production, the better chance it's going to run properly in production, right? So that SDLC of, look, I do need pipelines for these things. But outside of that, I need a replicable environment for my team to just literally put into this environment and do an experimentation, right? Experimentation is sort of the antithesis of automated pipelines right now, Like I can't experiment with, we have a customer that has 45 microservices. They're doing IoT ingestion stuff. How do you get 45 microservices up and running to go run a experiment, right? On your local machine, it's a disaster, right? In the cloud, through pipelines, it's incredibly difficult, right? So this explosion of microservices has created this new problem of it's too much. I can't manage it through pipelines, right? And so everybody's going back to monolith, and that's not a good idea. And so like we had to come up with a new way to manage all of the things, right? And so that idea of, all right, well, anytime we do a deployment, we're going to take a snapshot of it. And then so I can know for sure these microservices that go out to dev are exactly what was in production, right? So now I can actually do a hot fix of production in my dev environment, in a dark environment. So that's sort of that SDLC component of like that lifecycle is different for every shop, right? And shouldn't be bound by some automation pipeline.